Well, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you very much, Sir Robert, for that very kind introduction. And it's a real pleasure and a privilege, in fact, to speak to all of you on a subject that is close to me personally and certainly close to the company. And I'll talk really in those terms, trying to describe to you the process and the processes through which we feel technology can be developed, should be developed, touching both on our specific medical devices, but also healthcare in general. But let me start actually with a little bit of a background on Medtronic itself. And I think it's important to state this, because Medtronic was founded on the basis of biomedical engineering. And a mission of Medtronic was written in 1960 when the company was barely solvent. And the founder wrote the mission, and there's many tenets of the mission, but the most important tenet, which is inspirational but also a strategic guidance, is this one that's written right here, which is saying that we're a biomedical engineering company with a goal of alleviating pain, restoring health, and extending life of patients. The reason I point that out is because what it says is that not only are we a technology company, biomedical engineering, but we're a technology company focused on using that technology to change outcomes. And that's an important point, because in the end, we all interface with the healthcare system to improve our outcomes. And if you can use technology to improve outcomes, then surely that can only be right. And so that's a guiding principle that this company's had over generations of leaders. And it's one that truly is and will be an enduring strategy for the future. And I'll tell you a little more about it as we move along here. Like was just described, Medtronic is the example of biomedical engineering in many ways, because it was founded through the collaboration of a physician and an engineer working on solving a very specific problem. And in those days, that problem was the invention of the battery-powered pacemaker, which previous to that used to be a big device that was plugged into a wall. And so the company was started by identifying a very specific problem, a problem of one that was one of pacing the heart in a portable fashion, so it could be a real therapy as opposed to a temporary sort of a cure, if you like. And that focus on a very specific problem, and an engineer and a physician working together to solve the problem, and then gathering evidence around that problem, around that solution, and creating a business around it and helping people through that is the essence of Medtronic and the essence of biomedical engineering. Now, we've come a long way since then. We've ventured into many different areas, and thousands of such instances of physicians and engineers coming together and solving a problem have now been put in place, not only by us, but by companies around the world. And today, Medtronic covers a variety of different disease areas, well beyond just electrophysiology and cardiology, to interventional cardiology, to cardiac surgery, to a whole bunch of other areas within cardiology, but also to neuroscience, to diabetes, to general surgery. So in all of those areas, the one common theme is that we invent technology with a line of sight to changing an outcome. And that, believe it or not, does provide certain guidelines around how the company operates and what we do, and the sorts of skills that we develop over time. Now, let me talk about innovation and about technology. And like I said, the company starts with being a technology company. You don't change outcomes in our world without the technology. Sure, there are other institutions like hospitals and other providers who will change an outcome and will alleviate pain, restore health, and extend life without technology, with other capabilities. But for us, it's with technology. And so technology is, we call technology the lifeblood of the company itself. And so we start to think about technology in some structure, starting with continuous innovation. Continuous innovation is in many ways unique to medical devices because it's something that you learn from. You introduce a concept, and then through experience, finding out how the patient reacts to that and how the physicians or the implanters feel and what experience they go through in actually implementing a procedure. we make adjustments. And because these are engineered products with fairly short approval cycles and fairly short sort of evidence generation cycles, they can be done in a continuous fashion. So that's what we call continuous innovation, and something that I think is pretty unique in this space to medical devices, where things can be kind of changed as we go along. And I'll share with you some examples of that today. But you know, these are just some general examples of the sorts of areas that we're in. Equally importantly, our ability through technology to invent new markets and disrupt our existing markets. Now, these are also important, where we create new markets, and in many ways you could argue that we invent new markets and disrupt somebody else's market. But essentially, we call that invention of new markets. And we disrupt our own markets, and I'll give you examples of that too. So we think of technology, the application of technology in biomedical engineering, through innovation, invention, and disruption. Now, there are some key differences between them. Invention, continuous innovation, like I said, is unique to Medtronic, to medtech, is predictable, and it has a fairly rapid cycle time. Although it may be the case that it's rapid, the focus on improving clinical outcomes never goes away. In other words, it's there to improve something. And also here's where economic value is extremely important, because there can be a tendency to do things on the whim of a desire or with very little evidence and just introduce it out there and expect to get more money for it because the cycle time is so short. And it may be based on the desires of one experience somewhere. And so some rigor around this, some articulation of the economic as well as clinical value, I think is important to get the fair value for continuous innovation. Now, invention and disruption I'll bracket together, and these in many ways are more interesting in the sense that they offer new options for patients and clinicians. Some new way of doing things. It always requires robust clinical evidence, almost always requires clinical trials. It changes standard of care, and it requires differentiated reimbursement, because this is some new market and it requires payment. And to get reimbursement, you need to provide evidence, clinical evidence, that there's value being created. Now, to do this requires time. You know, clinical trials don't happen overnight, and clinical trials can go wrong. And so there's risk and there's investment and commitment that's required to do invention and disruption. If you're successful, however, it's a significant growth driver from a business perspective, and it's certainly companies who are willing to do this create a multi-year lead over their competition, because everyone else then has to go through the clinical trial process, and it takes time to establish this. So a mixture, now these take time, however, so a mixture of invention and disruption, together with continuous innovation, is the formula through which at least Medtronic works. And I think that mix of programs is what we do, with me and leaders in the organization and below them, kind of work on all the time, categorizing our work in these three areas and properly investing in them to have success. Let me give you some examples of this process. Let's start with the invention of a new market. What does that really take? It certainly takes the technology investment of, in this situation, a product called a solitaire, which is used for ischemic stroke treatment, a device that goes in and clears up a vessel. Now, that's the technology, and that's got its own sort of work involved and refinement, and then you gather evidence, get clinical trials, get approval, all the things that I just said. But then you continue to expand the market, and you do that through publications, through more studies, through incorporation and guidelines. All of this doesn't happen overnight. And all of this is involved in the invention of a new market, in creating a new market. Inventing the technology, providing the initial evidence, getting the reimbursement, but also changing the guidelines, having adequate publications, providing training to doctors, and then moving to a continuous innovation phase where you continue to expand that market to other areas. So that's an example of an invention of a new market. Let me go through a few more specifics. Here are three examples On the left here is an example of a transcatheter valve, the transcatheter aortic valve in this particular situation. This was introduced by us and another company about, I'd say, 5-6 years ago. And that was the invention and the creation of a new market, which actually disrupted the cardiac surgery market to some degree, but essentially it was a new market that was created because it reached patients who otherwise couldn't have surgery as well. And so a new market was created through the introduction of the transcatheter valve by, in this situation, 2 companies. Over the last 5 years, we've learned, like I said before, through the now thousands and thousands of procedures that have been performed, we have learned by experience as to what works and what doesn't, what could be made better, what could be made easier, where we could improve that outcome just that little bit more, what specific area could we address. And through that, we've introduced new versions. So it's shifted from invention to continuous innovation. And right now, every few years, sometimes as soon as every year, we come out with iterations of the core valve, which make it better and better. And it's very interesting to note that once you get into continuous innovation in medtech, 4 or 5 years after an initial pretty revolutionary product is introduced, the product is almost unrecognizable in terms of its improvements. And that the original product, which was so big in that it invented a market, almost seems archaic. And so this journey of continuous innovation, starting with the invention of a new market, we've seen this in front of our very eyes in the last 5 years as the transcatheter valve market, transcatheter aortic valve market has evolved. There's another example that is a bit now and a bit in the future. We heard about the pill-based endoscopy, and in our situation, we use something called a pill cam to essentially do virtual colonoscopies. And part of the continuous innovation in that process is one where we improve the efficiency of looking at the number of images used to detect a problem or not, and using artificial intelligence, using other methods through which we make that process better. We'd call that continuous innovation. However, we can also take the same concept and attach other sensors to the pill cam, to the little pill, and get other kinds of data, and use other kinds of artificial intelligence, maybe to detect cancer, maybe to do other kinds of diagnostics. That would create new markets. It would invent new markets for this kind of device. And there, from continuous innovation and the experience that we have there, we then move into a new space, and we call that a new market. Another example is in the area of diabetes, where the same kind of flow has happened, where you take a standalone pump, integrate that together with a sensor, which is continuous innovation, where you move to a better looking pump, which is easier to use with buttons and so on, which are modernized. And that's what we call continuous innovation. But then you can invent something which uses closed loop algorithms through which you can essentially create an artificial pancreas. We'd call that a disruption of our own therapies, because I can tell you we introduced the hybrid closed loop about 24 months ago, and since then the majority of our diabetes sales in the countries where it's approved has been that product, not the prior products. There we've disrupted our own market, where previously it was based on a pump-only sort of situation, has now been disrupted to pump and sensor artificial sensors. Sensors are now sold with virtually every pump we make, while previously it was with only 20% of the pumps, because it was used for other types of sort of unlinked guidance, if you like. So here are examples, and hopefully you can get fluid with the terminology, but technology and engineering in healthcare enables us to move seamlessly between continuous innovation, invention of new markets, and disrupting of existing markets. And I've got to tell you this, the next story about disruption, because it's so central to Medtronic and one that we are really proud of. And I told you the beginnings of the story, which was the invention of the pacemaker, disrupting the wall-powered pacemaker with a battery-powered pacemaker. We then moved very quickly into a device which was actually implantable back in 1960. So that was the first level of the second layer of disruption. The first was from the battery, from the wall to the battery, and then it's from the outside to the inside. And then we moved through a cycle of close to 40 to 50 years, where we had continuous innovation as electronics got smarter, as processors got smarter, as our ability to miniaturize improved, and to a point where about 2008, 2009, we felt, and the industry felt, that this whole area had matured to devices about so big, which had leads, and that was the pacemaker market. Well, engineers were working on disruptive technologies, on using miniaturization further to create a pacemaker that's the size of a pill, that's now inserted through a catheter, that lodges in the heart without any leads, that has a 10-year battery life. That's a disruption. So here you are in the space of something like 60 years, a little over 60 years. We've disrupted the pacemaker market in a very isolated space, the pacemaker market, very important, but pacemakers, 3 times. And so this is the kind of thing that medtech has to do and does so well. What's going on in the future now? Well, that same pacemaker, which is really originally made for the single chamber, we're going to expand through artificial intelligence algorithms, because this pacemaker, if you like, has a 3D accelerometer, it has a sophisticated processor, and we think we can make it the equivalent of a dual chamber device, and then move on to 100% coverage of all pacemaker patients. I would term that as continuous innovation. So here I hope you can get a sense as to the way in which we think about healthcare and about technology. Now, the thing that I think this audience doesn't need any convincing, but it is one that is important to recognize, that our quest, and by our, I mean our collective self, our desire and our quest to improve clinical outcomes will just never end. Because the availability of new technology, of miniaturization technology, of new materials technology, of other things will always be there. And our learning of the human body and its functionalities only increases over time. And you put the two together, and you have to conclude that technology to change clinical outcomes will continue forever. There's no line in the sand in 2018 that says that it's going to stop. It just isn't. And in many ways, it's only going to accelerate. And these are examples of things that we will do. And the only thing that I'll promise you, and these are all new things that we've just launched or will launch in the near future, and the only thing that I'll promise you on this page is that in the next 20 years, every single one of these will probably be obsolete. If not 20, maybe 30, maybe 10. But they will all be obsolete at some point in the future through the advent of new technologies. And what are those? There's miniaturization technologies, there's new materials, that's battery technology, which is growing very rapidly across different areas. There's biosensor technology, as all of you know. There's regenerative medicine, certainly robotics, that's a whole new area, and the whole area of data science and data analytics, artificial intelligence, our ability to connect, new ways to manufacture. These are all things that'll grow independent of healthcare. But we tap into this. And you just need to look at this and put basic logic together, and I think you'll all agree that our quest to improve clinical outcomes truly will never go away. And we see a future when we probably will have injectable pacemakers, believe it or not. We are working on ways to put injecting the pacemaker as opposed to through a catheter into areas where you can literally inject it. We'll have expandable transcatheter valves, and we'll have implantable left ventricular assist devices. Today you carry those along. We have programs in place, and it's going to take a while before the thing is implanted. Battery technology needs to improve, and maybe mixed with battery technology is a finer way in which we design the motor itself and a more efficient way of delivering the therapy. And then you can go through the list, and you can see many different areas where vast advances will be made. And I won't go through each of these in turn, but I hope you can capture that this is what we can see today. And I'm sure 20 years from now, someone can present the same page in these same areas, which is only a subset of healthcare, and probably put up a new set of thoughts for the future with early work happening, which will happen and become true at some time in the future. But the thing we've got to realize, and I'm going to pivot now to another point which is important in medtech and in healthcare, which we can never forget, is that, and is becoming increasingly important, that we have to increasingly not only understand the clinical value of these products, but we have to understand the economic value, because these things cost money. But the beauty about healthcare and a mission such as ours, which I hope is a more collective mission for all of us, the beauty of what we do is that we change outcomes. And I think you'll all agree that in improving an outcome, there is inherent value. If anyone interfaces with the healthcare system, there's one thing that they will pay for, which is to get better. They won't pay for a useless trip to someplace or a failed procedure, but they will pay to get better, that there's real value in getting better. I think we've got to take it to a step beyond just saying those words to articulating them quantitatively through economics. And I think that's essential, because if it is not, then the fair value of the technology that we come out with will never be determined. And if the fair value is not determined, you can get an escalation of cost. And technology will be blamed as being the most expensive thing around, and so therefore that's the problem. When in fact, fair value was never assigned, and the intent of the technology was to really create value which is unquestionable. And so that is something that we have to collectively work on, and the concept of economic value is one that we really have to understand and embrace. So along those lines is a further reflection of how the future has to evolve to, not in the next year, but certainly within the next decade or so. On the left is a depiction of the healthcare system as it is today. It's a fee-for-service system. You can call it different names. You can be, government-run, private, it doesn't matter. In general, we have a fee-for-service system everywhere in the world. And a fee-for-service system means, for us, that we get paid for a technology with a promise to change an outcome. The promise is credible. There are publications behind it. There's even reimbursement behind it. So it's credible. But nonetheless, it's a promise. A hospital does the same thing. They treat a patient with a promise that that patient will get better, with all the right intentions. That patient comes to a hospital with a certain problem, the patient's been treated, the patient leaves, it's supposed to be better. Maybe he uses our technology in the same process. The problem with that is that no one's accountable to make sure that the patient indeed gets better. And there's many variables, if you like, in the journey to reaching a good outcome. And if any one of those variables go wrong, the good work of any one area can be completely wasted. And so at some point in the future, we have to move to a system where we get accountability for the outcome as opposed to a promise to reach the outcome. I give this example a lot, and then I'll say it again because it's a very simple example. If we as a company, as a business, paid our salespeople on making sales calls as opposed to bringing sales, I think the company would probably go bankrupt in no time, with lots of sales calls with no revenue. That's because we're paying people to make sales calls. Well, if you pay people to do a service, they will do the service with all the right intentions, but no guarantee that the outcome is actually reached. The other thing that this also demonstrates is that on the left you have a model where the patient is the lowest and least important stakeholder amongst everyone else. Why? Because the patient has no recourse when things go wrong other than go back to the hospital and pay again. It's just like buying a car, driving the car out of the lot, the car breaks down, you somehow take it back, and then you've got to buy a new car. That's a fee-for-service system, which clearly, I think you'll appreciate, is not in the long term sustainable. It's there today because to move to an outcomes-based system is complicated. And it's easier said than done. You need, and I'll come to that in a second. But it's not easy. I'm not trivializing the problem. I'm not saying that we're all stupid for doing all the right things. I'm just recognizing that a system in which there is no accountability is not a sustainable system, and we collectively have to do something about it. And to the point that was made earlier, I think using an engineering thought process to address that, I think is a valuable way in which we can work. because you have to. There's so many variables here. Unless you follow a structured approach, you'll never be able to operationalize it, which takes me to my next point. That as we've tried to do this, and we've taken this on ourselves, and said that, look, we're a technology provider. We want to be responsible for an outcome. What do? And again, that was easier said than done. And we recognized over time that there's certain things which almost seems obvious, but people don't treat it as obvious, have to happen. What are they? Well, one thing is you have to be able to define an outcome. If you're going to be accountable for an outcome, let's define what that outcome is. Otherwise, how will you define accountability? The second thing you've got to do and define an outcome and know what cost is required to reach that outcome. And you need to be able to retrospectively baseline, and you need to be able to prospectively monitor that outcome and that cost. The second thing that has to happen is you have to have a clear understanding of the cohorts that deserve a certain kind of, that need a certain kind of treatment to get a very specific outcome. And you have to have that type of cohort in place. In other words, you can take a patient who's got comorbidities, is fairly old, maybe 70 plus years old or whatever, and go through a certain procedure, say a cardiac surgery. The expected outcome on that patient for the same procedure versus someone who's younger, without any comorbidities, is going to be different. And if you're going to be paid for an outcome, you have to know who you're treating. And so a clear understanding of the cohorts is also very important. So those are the two questions that one has to wrestle with before you even start thinking about this. That what is the outcome? Can you measure it? Can you monitor it? Who is this outcome relevant to? And do you have data and guidelines that support that? And can you segment patients in that way? Without those two questions, you cannot even begin the journey to create a value-based healthcare model. Then there's a third question. Well, how many variables are involved in going from the procedure to the outcome? Is it just a technology, which is the simplest way, where we've, for example, already created such business models, where the implantation of a certain technology will result in an outcome independent of anything else, independent of any medication, almost completely independent even of the doctor's skill because it's so simple? Or is it one where you have multiple variables? You have the patient prep is important, the doctor's skill is important, the discharge instructions are important, the patient has to adhere to a certain lifestyle or medication. All of that has to happen to reach a certain outcome. That still has to be addressed. But now you need alignment of many stakeholders, and it's a much more difficult problem. And so this is the way in which you have to operationalize healthcare. You have to break the problem down in granular pieces and understand what's the outcome you're trying to reach, who's the cohort you're addressing, who are the stakeholders involved in reaching that outcome, and then have joint accountability to reach that outcome. Otherwise, this won't happen. So that's the process that we're using. The other thing worth talking about a little bit is the way in which we're thinking about chronic care management versus episodic care. You know, Medtronic historically has been a company focused on episodic care because we treat acute instances. Perhaps the only exception may be diabetes, where we look at sort of chronic disease over time. But typically, a patient comes into the hospital and a certain procedure happens, the patient leaves the hospital. And we kind of know who the patient is, but really our effort is during the implantation of that technology. Now, there are key differences between these. First, the outcome measure for episodic care is one that is based on a recovery process as well as the result of the clinical intervention. The outcome measures during chronic care management is general health and certain clinical biomarkers, which happen periodically without an episode occurring. And so your ability to maintain general health, or maybe improve it, and to maintain the right level of, the right value of these clinical markers is your ability to manage chronic care successfully. If there's an escalation, you have to go into an episode. And the outcome measure for an episode is different, like I just said. It involves a recovery process as well as a result of the intervention that you just did in the episode, which is very specific. And so that's one way to think about it. But what it also told us as we looked at this is that as a company and as a group overall, our focus historically in healthcare has really been much more about episodes. and the discipline of data and the discipline of clinical trials, of procedures have really been driven by episodes. And there are certain implications to that. That when you're dealing with episodic care, your primary stakeholder is actually the physician. The patient in an episodic care is pretty much does what he or she is told. You go into a hospital or a clinic and you kind of do what you're told. You eat what you are given. You kind of get up and go wherever. You're in complete control of the healthcare provider. And the physician makes all those decisions. So our primary stakeholder in a situation like that is the physician. And so we provide data to convince the physician in their language, which is clinical papers, guidelines, as to what to do. And so our whole argument about how, or case about how things should be done is done in a way that a physician can relate to. A reimbursement model is built around paying for that procedure. That does exist. The care setting is almost always a hospital or some situation like that. And so that's what episodic care is. If you shift to chronic care, believe it or not, the primary stakeholder is now the patient. Because the patient is at home, under no control. They can choose whether to follow a certain lifestyle or not, whether to eat some things or not, whether to even take their medication or not, whether to perform certain activities or not. There is no reimbursement model that's really that specific. There are general models to do with paying primary care physicians and other models here and there, but there isn't any systematic model like we have in episodic care, where you pay a hospital to do a certain thing. Even though it's not outcome related, it's very focused. The site of care is in the home, and the way in which you convince a patient to do something is not the way in which you convince a doctor. You show doctors evidence through, journal publications. You don't do that to patients. And so we learned, believe it or not, that for us to look at chronic care management for patients with our devices, very specific and very narrow pool of patients, even that requires a step change in our own culture and the way we talk and the way we generate evidence and the way we communicate and the way we convince people to do things. Just that simple step. To translate that across healthcare is an even bigger task, but something that we have to do. And so this is something that we're focused on, and I'll just give you an example of the type of work that we're doing because that's of interest. When you talk about chronic care management, the payment models have to start with a population. And that's where companies like us and medtech companies in general kind of shy away. Because we don't deal with populations, we deal with cohorts. We deal with very specific cohorts where we know that there's a certain condition which we can fix or we can impact in some way. General populations are too big. However, you go to payers, whether it be the government or it be insurance companies or whoever, they talk in populations. You go and tell them, I'm going to look after heart failure devices with cardiac resynchronization devices. And they'll say, that's too small for me to worry about. Even if that pool, when collected and aggregated across all payers may be a big number, for a certain payer, that's not something that they're worrying about. If you go instead and tell them that I'm going to look after your most expensive comorbid populations, they'll open the door because they understand population health and say there's the most expensive pool of patients. They've got comorbidities. They come to the hospital twice a month. I don't know what to do with them. They've got everything wrong with them. There's no one clinical procedure. Take them. Okay, we take them. What do we do with them? And so we've started to develop certain methods. We started to work on remote patient monitoring, where we can improve the care of these patients. And we do that through statistical methods, which we've established, through which we can take a cohort of high-risk patients and determine which ones will respond to remote patient monitoring. And then we deploy these disease management programs, which then treat the different comorbidities remotely. That's the base model. But through that process, we also identify patients with very specific problems where we've got deep expertise, such as patients with devices, with heart failure or diabetes. And then we go into a very specific care protocol, which actually can save rehospitalization costs and other very serious costs because of our detailed knowledge of that patient. We clearly cannot apply that to everybody. But if we can find the patients who need that and then scale it, that's a model that we can use. So what we're working on, and this is very early, but one of the things that we're learning how to do is to build a bridge between very specific clinical programs and population health. And that's the only way that we can think of trying to build effective and efficient models to deliver chronic care, as opposed to general chronic care sort of population health management, which I think is important, but after a while will stop giving value. By general, I mean make sure that the patient's socioeconomic status is okay, that their home is heated, that the basic things are there. But beyond a certain point, you need a connection to the clinical care pathway, otherwise you'll never be able to manage that patient. Now, to do all of this, what's important is data. And again, we're in the beginnings of this. And data is something that we're getting from the patient directly, from devices, from providers, from payers. Using that data, we need to create intelligent platforms through which clinical action can be taken. Very early in our journey with this, we've isolated the need for this and working hard at developing methods through which we can get access to this data and creating these outcome management programs. This chart is perhaps a little more than a conceptual chart because we've actually got programs in place, but frankly, it's still very early in the whole journey to do that. Our goal eventually is to connect all of this together, and there's some buzzwords here and so on, but in the end, the idea is to use data in an intelligent way, to be able to manage patients both from a selection perspective and then from a personalized optimization perspective in both of those situations. And I think we're very early in our journey. I'm going to conclude with this page, which really tells you the importance of medtech in healthcare. We can do engineered solutions, and through engineered solutions, we can make a real impact. Our ability to understand technology, to invent, innovate, and disrupt will go on forever, and through data and analytics, we can eventually get there. So these are some important takeaways from what I just said. I think collaboration across disciplines between engineers and physicians and other scientists, collaboration between different stakeholders in the delivery of healthcare, thinking broadly and using data intelligently are really the keys. And using engineering thinking to all of this, I think can be a real asset. So with that, thank you very much. I might have run a little over, but thank you very much for your time.